Say hello to the new Syria. A sunny place to relax, unwind and leave the world behind. Exploding with history, culture and excitement, Syria is always beautiful. At least that's the official line being spruiked by the Syrian government in their tourism campaigns. Yes, tourism campaigns.
I could not be more excited.
And in these posts by a horde of travel vloggers holidaying under regime supervision.
Let's go inside.
Under President and accused war criminal Bashar al-Assad, the message is that the worst of the war is over. The new Syria is open, not just to visitors and investors, but to the millions of refugees who fled the regime and the war. It seems almost too good to be true.
De prøver at sige, at økonomi er godt, og det er et sikkerhedsland, og Bashar Assad han vil gerne have os tilbage, men det tror vi bare slet ikke på det. Det vil være virkelig farligt for vores liv i hvert fald, hvis det nu de har sendt os tilbage.
After 12 years of civil war, a growing number of countries are now saying that it's safe for Syrian refugees to go home. But with 6 million people still displaced, we've come to find out if going back to Syria could in fact be a deadly mistake. Denmark may seem an odd place to start a story about the war in Syria. But the country has taken in more than 34,000 Syrian refugees since the war broke out in 2011.
Jeg kalder ikke Syrien mit land. Jeg kalder Danmark mit land. Det er fordi Danmark har vist mig alle de min barndom, som har mistet i Danmark, som har mistet i Syrien, det viser her i Danmark. Ja, altså det skete, så må vi lige snakke om det. Om det skal ske noget eller nej. Og så må vi lige...
The Awad siblings fled Syria's capital Damascus with their parents almost a decade ago.
Nu når vi tager til København her næste uge, så kan vi da måske se, hvad de vil gerne gøre og sådan noget. Så kan vi lige høre ham.
Granted temporary residency, the siblings have thrived in Denmark. 22-year-old Mariam works in aged care. 19-year-old Aya recently finished high school, and 17-year-old Mohammed is still studying.
Jeg tror, vi skal til efter sommer.
Their memories of Syria they recount in fluent Danish.
Det er det eneste, jeg kan huske, det er krigen fra Syrien. Jeg kan slet ikke huske noget andet. Krigen, nogen der blev slået ihjel foran mig, nogen der vil slå dem, voldtager folk foran mig, og det er det eneste, jeg kan huske.
Det også slå på den her, det kemaui også.
Jeg fik selv min astma derfra, ikke? Ja.
Sparked by pro-democracy protests in 2011, the Syrian civil war has left the country violently scarred. Fighting between the Russian-backed forces of President Assad and a range of rebel groups has killed more than 350,000 people, inflicted barbaric human rights abuses, and seen 7 million Syrians flee the country, with a further 6 million displaced at home. But today, after regaining control of roughly 70% of the country, the Assad regime says it's time for citizens to return.
Talking about the future of Syria, I think it's fully open.
Despite the claims, stories of regime intimidation and the abuse of returnees are common. And only 6% of Syrians, once labelled as traitors for fleeing the war, have voluntarily gone back. So what was it that you wanted to show me?
Yes, I want to show you here.
After escaping the horrors of the Syrian war, the Awads thought they'd never return. But in 2019, Mariam and Aya received a devastating letter from the Danish government.
Altså her, det indgår i vores vurdering af dit opholdsgrund situation i Rif Damaskus provinsen over en længere periode siden maj 2018 har ændret sig markant. Det er derfor vores vurdering, at det ikke er en reel risiko for at blive udsat for overgreb i strid med den europæiske menneskerettigheder.
So, what does it mean for you and your sister?
Det betyder, at det ikke forlænge med opholdsstørrelse.
Claiming that some parts of Syria are now safe, Denmark's immigration ministry cancelled the sisters' visas and ordered them to go back.
Det er virkelig svært at tænke på det. Det er virkelig skræmmende at tænke på sådan noget der, om vi skal tilbage til Syrien. Vi ved slet ikke. Jeg kom slet ikke i tanker om, at det vil sende os tilbage efter så lang tid, vi har boet i Danmark.
In a cruel twist, their parents have permanent asylum as political refugees. And Mohammed is a minor, so he can't be deported, leaving the sisters to go back to Syria alone.
Jeg tænker bare at komme tilbage til Syrien. Jeg er bange, fordi jeg har ikke nogen derovre. Jeg har ikke familie. Jeg har ikke nogen venner derovre. Jeg tænkte, det er farligt, hvis mig og min søster kommer tilbage til Syrien.
The sisters now join the more than 1,000 Syrians who've had their visas reassessed thanks to a seismic shift in Danish immigration policy. Charlotte Slente from the Danish Refugee Council explains.
There was a law introduced in Denmark back in 2015 to grant temporary permits to refugees to Denmark, not based on their individual sort of human right situation or security situation, but based on the generalized situation of war and fighting in Syria. And it was also said that if conditions of fighting improve only a little bit, we might be looking at sending people back.
Based on the assessment of Danish authorities, refugees from designated conflict zones were granted temporary sanctuary, but their visas could be revoked if war ended in their areas. In 2019, with Assad's forces retaking large areas of the country, Denmark classified Damascus and its outer regions as safe, cancelling hundreds of protection visas in the process.
We do not understand why Denmark wants to stand out as the only country in Europe returning Syrians to Syria. I mean, these are people who have gone through so much difficulty. They have found refuge in Denmark. They are trying to build a life here. Their children go to school here. People have learned Danish. It's very, very difficult to understand these decisions by the Danish government, I have to admit.
Skal I have papir med til ham og sådan noget?
Ja, vi tager hele mine papirer. Hele papirer, ja.
Facing deportation, Mariam and Aya have applied for a hearing with the Danish Refugee Appeals Board. With the help of a lawyer, the sisters will argue they cannot safely return to Syria because their father is wanted by the regime. What would happen to you, do you think, if you were sent back to Syria?
Med det samme så vil de tage os på grund af de vil gerne have min far, og så vil de på et eller andet måde at komme i kontakt med min far. Hvis han vil ikke tilbage til Syrien, så bliver vi dræbt ned. Først vil de gerne voldtage os, og så bagefter vil de gerne dræbe os bagefter. Det er fordi vi flytter fra krigen, for ikke vi kan dø eller sker sådan noget med os. Det er derfor Danmark det er mit land. Jeg vil slet ikke forlade Danmark.
Mariam and Aya believe they have a strong case, but it's now been 2 years since they lodged their appeal, and they still don't have a hearing date.
Men tror I, at det vil lykkes, advokaten?
Det skal det. Ellers så må vi komme videre.
The Awad sisters face an anxious wait, but other refugees are in a more frightening limbo.
هدية السمان، اسمي هدية السمان. أنا من دمشق من سوريا. عندي 3 أولاد. مها عمرها 11 سنة، يحيى عمره 10، ويوسف عمره 8. أنا صار لي سنة هلأ ساكنة بأنسطوب. يعني مثل ما محبوسة بسوريا محبوسة هون.
Refugees who lose their appeals are brought to Avonstrup to await deportation.
Her har vi vores rum, vi sover i. Jeg har ikke så meget ting med. Her lægger jeg sådan mine ting og mine tegninger.
Last year, Hadiya and her children lost their temporary protection status after living in Denmark for close to a decade.
Der er en hus, og der er Danmark-flag, fordi jeg kan godt lide Danmark.
Hadiya refused to leave, and now she cannot be forcibly deported because of the Geneva Convention.
Denmark and other Western governments don't recognize the government of Bashar al-Assad, which means that you can actually not make an agreement with that regime about sending Syrians back.
Right, and until that happens, then they can't send anybody back. They're going to send them to these centres.
Yes.
That sounds like they could be there forever.
I mean, they could be there for a very, very long time, I would assess.
الدراسة ما بقدر أدرس لأنه أنا ما وقعت على الترحيل. ما فيني إني أشتغل لأنه مالي موقع على الترحيل. هلأ بس إنه بس الانتظار. بس يعني ما في غير هيك إنه مستنية.
Indefinite detention seems at odds with Denmark's socially progressive reputation, but the country is changing. Hoping to steal votes from rising populist parties, Denmark's left-wing government has introduced a series of hardline immigration reforms, reminiscent of Australia's Stop the Boat scheme.
It's our goal that they should go back home.
Aiming for 0 asylum seekers, refugees can now be sent to Rwanda for processing, have their assets confiscated to pay for detention, and those without visas who can lawfully be deported are being removed by force. What happens to Hadiya next is entirely up to Danish authorities. But this mother is adamant there's one place she will never go.
مستحيل إني أرجع على سوريا. لا، مستحيل. حابة أوصل إنه سوريا مو آمنة لمرة مع 3 أولاد، مو آمنة لعائلة، مو آمنة لنظام السوري. دبحنا، قتلنا، فجرنا، خلانا نشم الكيماوي، خلانا نشوف الحرف بعيوننا، موت أولادنا قدامنا، موت جوازنا، موت أهالينا. ما في أي سبب إنه أقدر أرجع لسوريا. بحس إنه ورقة التوقيع على سوريا مثل كأنه ورقة بيضة مكتوب عليها اسمي واسم أولادي، ورقة الوفاء إلي وإلهم، لأنه ما بقدر أوقع على ورقة وفاء إلي ولأولادي.
But is returning to Syria actually a death sentence? Turkey has borne the brunt of the Syrian refugee crisis. It's taken in about 3.6 million refugees, almost 4 times the number is taken in to the entire European Union. In cities close to the border, like Gaziantep, many Syrians have heard the regime's promise of peace. And we're here to find out what happens to those who return to Syria.
Hi, Evan.
Hi,
how are you?
Mohammed. Hi.
Hi.
Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. Good. You?
Thanks for coming. Yeah, good.
Thank you.
Mohammed Taha is a prominent Syrian activist and founder of NGO Justice for Life.
شغلنا أكثر شيء يركز عن توثيق الانتهاكات، اللقاء بالضحايا واللي تعرضوا لانتهاكات جسيمة خلال الحرب من 2011 وحتى يعني يومنا هذا.
As part of his work, Mohammed has been inside Syria, interviewing returnees and their families. Today, he's agreed to share his findings and take us to the Syrian border.
يعني نوعا ما.
Just one sec, sorry. If we can get there. We're stopped at a police checkpoint.
Can we take the press card, please?
Recent violence and mortar strikes near the border have authorities on high alert.
هون المعبر الحدودي بين سوريا وتركيا، وهون هاي الأبنية اللي مبينة قدامنا هي سوريا.
But with Syria in walking distance, this is as far as we can go.
يعني حال الوضع محزن أو صعبة، غير آمن الوصول لسوريا.
Just 10 kilometres from here, Turkish forces have been fighting various militias, and in November last year, Kurdish rebels were bombed in regime-held Aleppo. Clashes between Assad's forces and opposition groups continue in the province of Idlib. And last month, Damascus was hit by Israeli airstrikes. But despite continued fighting, it seems the greatest threat facing returnees is not war. What are you finding about people who are going back, returnees going back to Syria over the past few years?
اللي يرجع على مناطق سيطرة الحكومة لما يكون هو خارج سيطرة الحكومة بالدول المجاورة، غالبا ما يتم التعرض للاعتقال. تعرض للاعتقال بحجج انه هم مطلوبين لدى قوائم السلطات السورية، هم مطلوبين. وفي كثير روايات وشهادات من هذول الناجيات من المعتقل يتحدثون فيها عن الاستغلال الجنسي اللي كان يحصل، وأيضا كان في يتعرضوا لحالات ممكن اغتصاب وحالات تحرش داخل المعتقل. وأيضا بعض الروايات أو القصص اللي كانوا يحكوا لنا إياها الأشخاص اللي التقينا معهم بأنه كانوا يتعرضوا لابتزاز على الحواجز، وفي منهم يتعرض أيضا للتعذيب والإهانة على الحواجز. البعض أيضا منهم صرح بأنه هذول الأشخاص وخصوصا من فئة الشباب تم سحبهم إلى الخدمة الإلزامية بالجيش.
Away from the border, we managed to secure an interview with a young man who recently went back to Syria and says he was detained by the regime. His story is frightening.
قضيت فترة يمكن 3 شهور بالسجن. كنت سبب من أسباب إنه خربت الدولة، يعني انضرب وإهانات وذل وشحط، يعني بيحملوك شيء أنت ما لكيش سبب فيه ولا لك أي دخل فيه، إنه أنتوا أهل المنطقة الفلانية أنتوا خربتوا وأنتوا طلعتوا وأنتوا سويتوا. وأنا وقتها لما صارت الأحداث هاي كنت يعني صغير، كنت وقتها كان عمري 14 سنة.
Ibrahim and his family fled from Syria to Jordan when he was just a boy. They returned to their village when they thought it was safe. But when Ibrahim visited Damascus in 2019 to apply for a passport, he says he fell victim to the regime.
مشان نطلع الورقة هاي وصلت لهناك على في المبنى، هو بيقولوا له جوازات. أول ما وصلنا على المبنى هذا إنه شاف اسمي فوراً وقت اعتقلوني. وهم كمان كانوا يعايلونا، يعني معاملتهم إنه كحيوانات، تعلقوك على الحيط من إيديك وتظل يعني فوق 8 ساعات 9 ساعات 10 ساعات. يحط واحد جنبيك يبلش يضرب فيه وضرب إنه يخليك أنت وينك إنه تسمع صوت اللي جنبك، إنه شو في عندك مثلاً حكي بتحكيه، وإذا ما أنتش عامل هالإشي بتقول إنه أنا عملته، يعني بس مشان ما توصل للمرحلة اللي وصل فيها الشاب اللي جنبك مثلاً. يعني الضرب اللي يضربونه إياه والتعذيب إشي مو طبيعي.
Ibrahim says he was released without charge after a relative bribed prison officials. But he was immediately taken into the army and served 6 months before fleeing and later paying people smugglers to get him to Turkey. What do you think would happen to you if you went back to Syria now?
إذا برجع هسه حاليا من الفترة هاي أو الفترة اللي قدام لو بعد سنة وسنتين اعتقال فورا. والله أعلم يعني بطلع عايش من الأفرع اللي راح أفوت عليها ولا ما بطلعش.
Shockingly, Ibrahim and others like him could soon face that situation. There are rumours the Assad regime is negotiating the forcible return of Syrians from Turkey. I asked Ibrahim why he thinks the regime wants them back.
السبب الرئيسي اللي راح يصير بهذا الشيء المصاري. إنه هاي أول سبب. لأنه كثير صارت عندنا اعتقالات يدفعوا لهم المبلغ اللي يحددوا لهم مبلغ الرقم الكذا ويطلعوا يدفعوا ويطلع الشاب. والسبب الثاني بدهم عالم تروح على الجيش.
Some governments in Europe are now saying that Syria is safe to go back to. What would you say about that?
إنه راح يتندموا كثير وراح يعانوا من العيشة هناك. السجن يعني معروف السجن عند النظام السوري.
النساء اللي ممكن يرجعوا من مناطق خصوصا المناطق اللي هي خارج سوريا خلينا نقول الدول الأوروبية على سبيل المثال أو الدول المجاورة قد يتعرضوا لانتهاكات وقد يتعرضوا لاعتقال عند دخولهم قد يتعرضوا لاختفاء قسري. نعم نحن نقوم بشكل يومي لتوثيق الأحداث وتوثيق كافة الانتهاكات. نلتقي بالشهود الذين تعرضوا للاعتقال أو تعرض ذويهم للموت تحت التعذيب. المناطق الخاضعة لسيطرة الحكومة السورية مطلقاً ليست آمنة.
We put these allegations to the Syrian government, but they did not respond. According to human rights groups, over 95,000 people have been forcibly disappeared by the regime since the war began. A world away, Mariam and Aya's fight against deportation to Syria is at a critical point.
I dag vi kommer til at vide, om vi kan blive i Danmark, eller det kan blive smidt ud af Danmark. I dag kan vi se vores fremtid, om det bliver godt, eller skal vi tilbage til Syrien og dø.
The sisters' case is finally being heard by the Danish Refugee Appeals Board. They hope that by presenting evidence similar to Mohammed and Ibrahim's, the board will rule that deporting them to Syria is inhumane.
Vi ved ikke, hvad der kommer til at ske med os. Ja. Vi er meget nervøse. Vi ved ikke. Stress. Ja. Jeg har ikke nogen ord til det. Nej, vi er meget stressende.
After a 2-year wait, the sisters are finally called before the board. With their future in the hands of Danish authorities, I want to know how they ended up here in the first place. Denmark has revoked the temporary protection visas of hundreds of Syrian refugees, threatening to deport them back into danger.
We are present in almost 40 countries around the world where we have operations.
Founded in 1956, the Danish Refugee Council is Denmark's largest non-profit organisation and one of the world's leading refugee protection groups.
So our humanitarian assistance is very much related to supporting both internally displaced in countries, but also refugees that are hosted by neighbouring countries to conflict.
But when Danish authorities classified parts of Syria as safe, their decision was partly based on the findings of a 2019 report co-authored by the DRC.
The report on Syria was a report on the security situation in Syria back then in 2019 when it was elaborated.
And what was the finding of your report?
I mean, the report itself doesn't provide any conclusions. It only talked about the security situation and saying that yes, security conditions have improved in Damascus and Rif Damascus, so the broader area of Syria. But the Danish government decided to interpret the fact that there is no fighting as being equal to it being safe to sending back Syrians to Syria.
Is that the problem with the report, basically, that it's allowed it to be used in this way?
No, I think the major problem here is the law that was passed back in 2015, where you even say that slight improvements in the situation of fighting in a given country could pave the way for actually starting to look at returns.
That was known before your report was actually written. So by then coming to the conclusion that there is some peace in some parts of the country, were you knowingly getting yourselves in that situation where the report would be used as a basis?
I don't think you can say that. This report doesn't say anything about whether it's safe for Syrians to return.
Yeah, but you knew the government was looking for a reason to send people back. They had the visa category for that. So again, was it the right thing to be involved? Is it not better perhaps to have not been involved in the report that now is being cherry-picked?
There's always a risk that you can use a report in an erroneous way, which was done here.
Does it make you perhaps rethink whether DRC should be doing these sort of reports in future?
Actually, we consider every time we are invited in to participate in one of these fact-finding reports whether we want to contribute or not. And we have obviously serious conversations with authorities here on these topics and continue to do so.
Historically, the third largest contributor to the DRC's budget has been the Danish government. The DRC vehemently maintains that this does not influence their work or their reports. After a 2-year wait, the Refugee Board has finally reached a verdict in the Awad sisters' case. Mariam and Aya have been granted a continued resident visa, overturning their deportation and paving the way to full citizenship.
Vi fik det. Endelig har vi gjort det. Tak, tak. Så fik vi vores drøm. Yes. Det er jeg virkelig glad. Vi har slet ikke nogen ord til, at jeg tror, at vi lever nu. Sådan en ny liv. Nu har vi. Yes.
But the moment is bittersweet. A third of appeals that reach the court fail, leaving families to choose between a detention centre or going back to Syria.
Og der er rigtig mange, der har ikke deres opholdstilladelse endnu. Vi skal bare kæmpe mod det. Fordi de siger, at Syrien er et sikkerhedsland, og jeres land har brug for jer. Men vores fremtid er nu her. Vi skal ikke tilbage til Syrien, vi skal blive i Danmark. Danmark, det er vores land nu.